In the waning years of the 16th century, Prague stood as a city of contradictions, a jewel of Central Europe that gleamed with architectural grandeur and yet trembled beneath a shroud of fear and superstition. The winding streets, lined with ornate Gothic spires and Baroque facades, bore witness to the opulence of the ruling elite, while shadows pooled in the narrow alleys where beggars, thieves, and the desperate eked out their daily existence. It was a city alive with whispers, where the flickering torchlight cast strange shapes upon cobblestones slicked by the rains, and every corner seemed to harbor secrets best left undisturbed. The air carried a mixture of soot, the scent of freshly baked bread, and the subtle undertone of decay that hinted at the underlying tensions permeating the city's walls. Citizens walked in cautious rhythm, acutely aware of the invisible boundaries that separated the powerful from the powerless, the privileged from the poor, and life from the ever-looming shadow of death. Prague's political climate only heightened this sense of unease. The Holy Roman Empire, under the waning authority of its emperor, struggled to maintain control over the fractious nobility and the restless populace. Religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants festered like an open wound, igniting suspicion, resentment, and sporadic violence that could erupt at a moment's notice. Every noble house was a microcosm of ambition and rivalry, their wealth and influence secured not merely by inheritance, but by strategic marriages, cunning alliances, and, when necessary, ruthless elimination of enemies. In such a volatile environment, the facade of civility often masked a darker, more primal reality, where deception was currency and trust a dangerous luxury. Rumors were a powerful weapon, capable of toppling reputations and inciting vengeance, and the city thrived on gossip whispered behind ornate screens and beneath vaulted ceilings. Among the common people, stories circulated of aristocrats who indulged in secretive pleasures, exploiting their wealth and privilege with a cruelty that bordered on the supernatural. Tales of poisoned wines, vanished servants, and mysterious illnesses filled the taverns, passed from one frightened patron to another in hushed tones. Yet, for the wealthiest, the city was a stage for grandeur. Banquets were held in candlelit halls with ceilings painted to resemble the heavens, tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies, imported spices, and roasted meats. Music swelled as lutes and violins provided a backdrop to laughter and toasts. But behind the mirth lurked tension, rivalries hidden beneath smiles, and the ever-present possibility of treachery. In Prague, even a smile could conceal a dagger, and every toast might mask a curse. The contrast between the city's glittering surface and its sinister undercurrents was perhaps nowhere more evident than in its marketplaces and alleys. Merchants hawked their wares alongside street performers, while pickpockets and con men moved with practiced ease, exploiting the naive or distracted. Children darted between carts and animals, and the poor scavenged whatever scraps were left behind. The wealthy looked down upon this chaos with detached amusement, oblivious or indifferent to the suffering below. Yet, the sense of danger was omnipresent, as citizens understood that the social order, while rigid, was fragile. Violence, sudden accusations, and secret vendettas were constant threats, lurking behind every door and shadowed corner. Superstition and fear held a particular grip on Prague's collective imagination. The city was renowned for its mystical traditions and occult practices, with astrologers, alchemists, and charlatans enjoying patronage from those who sought to bend fate or gain an advantage. Legends of spirits wandering the old bridges, witches consorting with the devil in hidden courtyards, and ghosts of the unjustly executed haunting their murderers were commonplace. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were warnings, a subtle reminder that power carried consequences, and that hubris could provoke forces far beyond mortal comprehension. Even the nobility, who considered themselves enlightened and rational, could not escape the whispers of dark arts and secret rites, particularly in an era when knowledge itself was intertwined with suspicion. Within this intricate web of politics, superstition, and social hierarchy, fear became a form of currency. Nobles watched one another with wary eyes, servants moved in silence, and commoners knew better than to speak out of turn. Every gesture, every smile, Every invitation to a meal could carry hidden meaning, and the boundaries between friend and foe were often blurred. The most dangerous games were not fought on battlefields but within the ornate halls of palaces, where whispered conversations, poisoned letters, and subtle manipulations could decide the fate of entire families. The very air seemed to hum with a sense of foreboding, a quiet anticipation that something extraordinary and horrifying was about to unfold. It was against this backdrop that the infamous noblewoman, whose name would one day become synonymous with macabre indulgence, moved like a shadow herself. She navigated the palaces and salons with charm, intelligence, and an unnerving calm, her ambitions carefully masked by social grace. Those who encountered her were often unaware of the calculating mind behind the gentle gestures and polite smiles. In Prague, the line between elegance and menace was perilously thin, and she had mastered the art of walking it. The city, teeming with intrigue and danger, provided fertile ground for her desires, ambitions, and eventual transgressions. The streets of Prague held countless untold stories of desperation and malice, yet the events set in motion by this noblewoman would eclipse them all. The city's shadows had always concealed secrets, but none would be as horrifying, as unforgettable, or as darkly fascinating as the tale of the feast that would shock an entire continent. In the quiet moments before her actions came to light, Prague seemed suspended in time, its citizens unknowingly on the precipice of witnessing a horror that would be recounted for centuries. The city's glittering palaces, hidden alleys, and superstitious whispers formed the perfect stage for a story where ambition, cruelty, and human desire intersected with the grotesque, setting the tone for the unimaginable events to follow. Every corner of Prague seemed alive with tension, every corridor whispered secrets, and every face in the crowded streets might hide motives dark and unspeakable. The city was a living entity, breathing fear, ambition, and intrigue into its inhabitants, shaping them in ways both subtle and profound. And within this tapestry of beauty and terror, the noblewoman plotted, observed, and waited, her mind a labyrinth of intentions and desires. In this city of shadows, the stage was set, the players in place, and the first act of a nightmare that would become legend quietly began to unfold. Born into a world of gilded privilege and rigid expectations, the noblewoman grew up in a household where appearances were paramount and power dictated every interaction. Her family belonged to the upper echelons of Prague's aristocracy, a lineage traced through generations of strategic marriages, political alliances, and accumulated wealth. From a young age, she was immersed in a culture that demanded perfection, her education carefully curated, her manners scrutinized, and her social interactions calculated to secure the family's influence. Tutors instructed her in multiple languages, literature, music, and etiquette, yet alongside these refined lessons, she absorbed the subtler, more insidious education of power and manipulation. She observed the delicate balance of courtly life, where a misplaced word could destroy reputations, and every gesture carried weight. In the quiet corners of her home, she witnessed the dynamics of dominance, submission, and betrayal, learning that control could be wielded as skillfully as a blade. Her childhood was not devoid of darkness, for the noble household, while opulent, was steeped in strict hierarchies and veiled cruelty. Servants whispered of punishments administered behind closed doors, of favors bought with fear rather than loyalty, and of secrets that could ruin a life in an instant. Her parents, emblematic of the era's duality, displayed generosity in public yet demanded obedience and discretion at home. Observing them, she internalized the lesson that appearances were a mask, one that could conceal motives, sins, and desires. It was in these formative years that her fascination with influence and control began to take root, quietly nurtured by a mind both keen and ambitious. She learned that charm could disarm suspicion, smiles could disguise intent, and silence could be as powerful as any decree or command. By adolescence, the young noblewoman had become adept at navigating the complex social terrain of Prague's elite. She attended salons, balls, and religious ceremonies, always observing, always calculating. Her beauty, carefully cultivated and complemented by sharp intelligence, drew attention and admiration, yet she wielded it not merely as ornamentation, but as a tool. Friendships were formed with precision, alliances sought for utility rather than affection, and rivalries noted and catalogued for future use. Even among her peers, she developed a reputation for subtle cunning, a capacity to bend conversations, favors, and even perceptions to her advantage. Small acts of manipulation, convincing a servant to misplace a letter, whispering a half-truth that unsettled a rival, prepared her for the more consequential games that awaited in adulthood. As she matured, the stakes rose. Marriage was no longer a personal choice, but a strategic instrument. Families negotiated unions that promised expansion of influence, consolidation of estates, and alignment with powerful allies. In this environment, her wit and charm became invaluable. Suitors were assessed not merely for affection but for potential gain, and she learned to navigate the delicate art of feigned interest and strategic retreat. Her psychological acuity sharpened. She could read moods, discern hidden motives, and anticipate moves before others recognized them. It was a world in which patience and observation were as essential as strength or wealth, and she proved herself more than capable of both. The noblewoman's social ascent was matched by her increasing awareness of human frailty and ambition. She observed the jealousies, resentments, and unspoken desires that simmered beneath polite conversation and public smiles. Courtiers gossiped behind silken drapes, servants plotted small acts of vengeance, and even the clergy wielded influence through veiled threats or favors. To her, these dynamics were not obstacles but instruments, opportunities to manipulate, control, or remove those who stood in her way. It was a time when minor slights could escalate into lifelong grudges, and she developed a keen understanding of how grudges could be exploited, how fear could be weaponized, and how loyalty could be purchased, coerced, or deceived. Early indications of cruelty emerged in subtle but undeniable ways. She tested limits, observing reactions to minor humiliations, experimenting with control over those weaker than herself, and learning which tactics provoked obedience and which bred defiance. To outsiders, these acts might have appeared trivial or even playful, yet to those who experienced them firsthand, they were unsettling glimpses of a mind increasingly comfortable with manipulation and eventually cruelty. Her servants and peers became unwitting participants in a psychological game that would escalate over the years, creating a web of fear, obedience, and silent observation that mirrored the power structures of Prague itself. By the time she reached full adulthood, the noblewoman had honed her tools: charm, intelligence, observation, patience, and the capacity for calculated cruelty. She understood that her beauty, wit, and social position were weapons just as sharp and lethal as any dagger. Her ambitions were no longer abstract notions of influence. They were concrete, actionable designs that required meticulous planning, unwavering focus, and a willingness to transgress boundaries others dared not approach. She had learned that power demanded not only possession but performance, the careful orchestration of perception and reality, of fear and admiration. It was within this intricate lattice of privilege, rivalry, and psychological acuity that the seeds of her infamous deeds took root. The noblewoman's rise in Prague was not merely the story of a young girl maturing into a woman of status. It was the emergence of a mind capable of orchestrating events that would shock contemporaries and echo through history. In the gilded halls and shadowed corners of the city, she moved with the grace of one who knew the rules yet intended to rewrite them, whose intellect and ambition outpaced even the most cunning of her peers. The stage was set, the players were arranged, and the groundwork for a story that would horrify and fascinate was quietly, meticulously being laid. As the noblewoman settled into the full privileges of her station, the world of Prague revealed itself in ever more treacherous detail. Rivalries were no longer abstract. They became living, breathing threats that required constant vigilance and calculation. In the salons and candlelit halls of the city's elite, subtle gestures, whispered comments, and fleeting glances conveyed messages far more potent than any declaration. Nobles vied for influence with every tool available: marriage, alliances, public favor, and, increasingly, secrecy. She observed it all with meticulous attention, cataloging enemies and allies alike, noting their weaknesses, desires, and hidden ambitions. Every social interaction became a chessboard, each conversation a move with consequences that might unfold years later. It was within this intricate web that she began to weave her own patterns of manipulation, her mind turning darker, more audacious, as her understanding of human vulnerability deepened. Food, once a mere pleasure, became an instrument of power. Banquets were not only displays of wealth but stages upon which influence, dominance, and intimidation were projected. She studied the rituals of these feasts, observing how hosts controlled not just the menu but the very atmosphere of the room. Guests were often tested with delicate choices, a rare spice signaling favoritism, a dish withheld as a slight, the arrangement of seats hinting at rank or contempt. Within these nuances lay subtle forms of control, and she quickly grasped that mastery over such events could translate into social dominance. It was not enough to be beautiful or intelligent. To command attention and obedience, one needed to manipulate experience itself, bending reality through food, ambience, and perception. It was during this time that her fascination with poison began to emerge. Historical accounts and whispered rumors suggest that her experimentation was methodical. Rare herbs, exotic spices, and subtle toxins became part of her secret arsenal, tested in minute doses upon animals, servants, and eventually, willing or unsuspecting participants. The knowledge she accumulated was not merely practical. It was a study of human response, a psychological map of fear, compliance, and vulnerability. The aristocracy of Prague, despite outward appearances of refinement and rationality, was remarkably susceptible to subtle influence, and she exploited this with increasing precision. The thrill was not solely in the act of poisoning, but in the awareness that she could manipulate life and perception without immediate consequence, that her intellect and daring allowed her to transcend ordinary moral constraints. Rivalries intensified as the noblewoman moved with calculated boldness. Families jostled for power and prestige, alliances shifted unpredictably, and long-held grudges found new fuel in minor disputes. In this charged atmosphere, her capacity for subtlety became an advantage. She orchestrated misunderstandings, sowed distrust among competing households, and leveraged rumors to weaken her adversaries. The nobility often underestimated her because of her youth and the social expectation that women be passive observers. Yet, behind her composed demeanor, she accumulated influence incrementally, shaping perceptions and outcomes with the precision of a master strategist. The culmination of this period of intrigue was her first forays into orchestrating forbidden feasts. Historical accounts hint at early events in which select guests experienced meals that were simultaneously sumptuous and unnerving, with exotic ingredients that provoked curiosity and discomfort. The act of preparing and serving these dishes became a performance of dominance, a subtle assertion of control over those who believed themselves secure in their privilege. She reveled in the tension between outward celebration and inward unease, observing reactions, testing limits, and cataloging fear and desire as meticulously as she monitored alliances and rivalries. Every guest, every servant, every participant became part of an experiment in manipulation, where the boundaries of propriety and morality were tested under the guise of hospitality. Even her servants were not immune to the lessons of power she imparted, whether consciously or unconsciously. They observed her meticulous preparation, the attention to detail in menus and seating arrangements, and the subtle signals embedded in conversation and presentation. Fear, respect, and curiosity coexisted in their minds, and she recognized that these responses could be harnessed to reinforce obedience and secrecy. In this way, her household became a microcosm of her larger ambitions, a controlled environment where she could study, manipulate, and exercise power without resistance. The psychological impact of these experiments on her targets cannot be overstated. Nobles who attended her banquets often left unsettled, their confidence shaken by minor anomalies, unexpected flavors, or unexplained illnesses. Some reported feeling subtly violated, as if their senses and judgments had been manipulated, while others developed irrational fears and suspicion of even their closest allies. Through these acts, the noblewoman refined her understanding of human psychology, learning to provoke anxiety, compliance, and even loyalty through fear and controlled experience. The acts themselves, though at this stage not yet lethal, foreshadowed the darker developments to come, setting a pattern of experimentation, observation, and incremental escalation that would culminate in horrors unimaginable to the uninitiated. Prague itself, with its shifting alliances, political instability, and culture of secrecy, provided the perfect environment for such machinations. In a city where even minor slights could lead to duels, exile, or ruin, her ability to exploit human weakness and manipulate perception became increasingly formidable. The noblewoman moved through this world with poise and patience, her intellect and cruelty growing in tandem. By the time she prepared her first truly forbidden feast, she had amassed not only the means, but also the understanding to orchestrate events with terrifying precision. The web of intrigue she spun was complex, dangerous, and invisible to those who trusted appearances, demonstrating the chilling effectiveness of calculated cruelty under the guise of social grace. It was in these years, through a combination of rivalry, observation, and forbidden experimentation, that the noblewoman laid the foundations for the act that would secure her place in history's darkest chapters. The line between curiosity and obsession blurred, and what began as subtle manipulation escalated into a deliberate, conscious engagement with fear, power, and transgression. Every feast, every whispered rumor, and every small act of cruelty honed her skills and emboldened her ambitions, preparing her for the ultimate display of control, dominance, and horror that would soon terrify Prague and echo through time. The night of the infamous feast arrived like a shadow creeping over Prague, silent and inevitable. Candles flickered along the walls of the grand hall, casting dancing silhouettes upon the polished surfaces, gilded mirrors, and ornate tapestries that depicted generations of noble triumphs. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted meats, exotic spices, and the faint, unplaceable aroma that hinted at something darker beneath the surface. The noblewoman moved through the room with impeccable poise, her eyes scanning her guests, her smile practiced, yet her mind calculating every nuance of the evening. To those attending, it appeared to be a celebration of refinement and wealth, a testament to her status and taste, yet every detail had been orchestrated with a sinister precision that only she fully understood. The guests, unaware of the horror awaiting them, arrived in their finest attire, their faces radiant with anticipation and curiosity. They did not suspect that beneath the lavish display of porcelain, silver, and crystal lay an unthinkable betrayal, a transgression so grotesque that it would haunt those who survived and shock generations to come. The noblewoman, in her meticulously composed role as hostess, offered polite conversation and delicate smiles, subtly observing reactions to the food, the seating, and the conversation. Every gesture, every comment, every carefully placed dish was a study in human psychology, a test of perception and compliance. She had transformed the banquet into a stage, and the unsuspecting nobles were both performers and audience, enacting roles written by her own design. As the meal progressed, the dishes arrived, each more sumptuous than the last. Exotic sauces, rare spices, and unfamiliar textures delighted the senses, while an undercurrent of unease began to ripple among some of the more perceptive attendees. The noblewoman watched silently, her eyes glinting with a combination of anticipation and detached satisfaction. Subtle reactions, an eyebrow raised, a hesitation before taking a bite, a slight tremor in a hand, were noted with precision. She understood that the mind's vulnerability to suggestion, fear, and confusion could be as potent as any physical act, and she used it to amplify the tension within the room. The banquet, outwardly a scene of elegance and pleasure, became an exercise in control, manipulation, and terror. Then came the moment when the true horror of the feast was revealed, though initially masked by layers of illusion and denial. Dishes that had seemed exotic and intriguing now carried the unthinkable truth, the forbidden substance hidden beneath sauces and garnishes. Shock and disbelief flickered across the faces of her rivals as the realization sank in, some struggling to comprehend the grotesque reality before them. The noblewoman maintained her composure, her movements deliberate and graceful, as if the room were a stage and she merely performing a final act. Panic and revulsion rippled through the guests, yet they were bound by social expectation, decorum, and the subtle psychological grip she had cultivated over the evening. Fear, confusion, and denial intertwined, creating a moment of exquisite tension in which horror and fascination coexisted in equal measure. The reactions of the guests varied widely, revealing the depth of her psychological manipulation. Some recoiled in quiet terror, unable to voice their understanding, paralyzed by the shock of both revelation and disbelief. Others attempted rationalization, convincing themselves of error, mistake, or jest. A few, particularly those whose curiosity or arrogance outweighed caution, examined the evidence with trembling hands, their faces paling as comprehension dawned. Throughout the room, the noblewoman's eyes tracked every subtle movement, every flicker of expression, every whisper of conversation. She catalogued terror, confusion, and revulsion as meticulously as she had her previous experiments, the scene unfolding as both a test and a performance, a culmination of years of preparation, observation, and experimentation. Historical accounts suggest that the psychological control she exerted was as deliberate as the act itself. The dining room, with its high ceilings, polished floors, and gleaming chandeliers, amplified the tension, every echo magnifying whispered disbelief. Candles created pools of light and shadow, exaggerating expressions of horror while concealing subtle gestures, secret smiles, and the tiniest manipulations of plates, utensils, and seating arrangements. Even the servants, silent witnesses to the unfolding atrocity, moved with careful precision, their awareness of consequences ensuring their compliance and silence. The noblewoman had orchestrated every aspect, transforming the evening into a study of power, influence, and human vulnerability, where the grotesque reality of the feast was heightened by the environment itself. As the night wore on, horror and fascination intertwined, creating an atmosphere of almost ritualistic intensity. Guests struggled to maintain composure, some whispering to neighbors, others retreating inward, paralyzed by shock. The noblewoman observed these behaviors with a detached intensity, savoring the combination of fear, respect, and helplessness. This was more than a feast. It was an assertion of ultimate control, a performance of dominance that transcended social norms, morality, and expectation. Through the carefully constructed layers of elegance, ceremony, and manipulation, she had demonstrated a power both terrifying and mesmerizing, leaving an indelible mark on all who were present. By the time the final course was served, the banquet had achieved its intended effect. Shock, disbelief, and horror had been meticulously calibrated to create maximum psychological impact, leaving her rivals both humiliated and traumatized. Even long after the evening concluded, the memory of the feast lingered, a shadow over Prague's nobility, a chilling reminder of the extremes to which ambition, cunning, and cruelty could reach. The noblewoman, composed and unrepentant, had transformed a social ritual into a dark legend, a story that would be whispered in fear, fascination, and disbelief for generations. In that hall, surrounded by opulence and horror alike, the line between elegance and monstrosity had been erased, leaving only the enduring legacy of control, fear, and the darkest expression of human ambition. The morning after the infamous feast, Prague seemed both unchanged and profoundly altered. The streets were alive with the usual bustle of merchants, servants, and townsfolk, yet beneath the routine, a current of unease had taken hold. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers traveling from tavern to market square, from noble salons to convent halls. The night's horrors had not remained hidden. Even the most discreet guests carried fragments of truth into the city's web of intrigue. These whispers, initially dismissed by some as exaggeration or scandalous gossip, gradually gained weight as multiple accounts converged on the same horrifying conclusion. The noblewoman, whose elegance and composure had so long masked her ambitions, found that the same tools of perception she had wielded with such skill were beginning to turn against her. Authorities were drawn into the growing storm of suspicion. Investigations, initially tentative, gained momentum as testimonies accumulated. Servants and attendants, once loyal through fear or complicity, began to speak under pressure or duress, revealing inconsistencies in accounts and peculiar events from the night of the banquet. Letters, notes, and observations collected from multiple sources began to form a chilling mosaic, implicating the noblewoman in acts that exceeded the bounds of imagination. Prague's legal system, already complicated by overlapping jurisdictions and political rivalries, struggled to comprehend the scope of the crime. Yet the weight of witness testimony and tangible evidence made denial increasingly impossible. Even those in her social circle, previously hesitant to confront scandal for fear of reputation, began to distance themselves, unwilling to bear the consequences of association with such infamy. The public reaction was a volatile mixture of fascination, horror, and disbelief. In taverns, markets, and public squares, citizens recounted the events with growing embellishment, each retelling amplifying the grotesque details. Nobility, accustomed to secrecy and discretion, could not entirely contain the story within polite circles, and the tale of the feast began to permeate even distant estates. It was not merely the act itself that captivated imagination. It was the audacity, the meticulous planning, and the deliberate cruelty that set this incident apart. In a city accustomed to intrigue and rivalry, few could fathom the depth of manipulation and psychological control exercised by one woman. The noblewoman's fall, once inevitable, became a public spectacle of moral reckoning, magnified by collective fascination and fear. Court proceedings were fraught with tension and spectacle. Witnesses recounted events in painstaking detail, their voices trembling, their expressions haunted by memory. Servants described subtle manipulations, peculiar arrangements of dishes, and unexplained illnesses, painting a portrait of premeditation and deliberate cruelty. Neighbors and acquaintances testified to her calculated demeanor, observing behaviors that, in retrospect, revealed a mind singularly focused on control and domination. The noblewoman's defenders, limited in number and influence, struggled to counter the mounting evidence, and attempts at charm, obfuscation, or denial proved increasingly ineffective. The weight of accumulated testimony, combined with the city's fascination and outrage, created an inexorable force that left her world teetering on the brink of collapse. Psychological analysis of the noblewoman, both contemporary and modern, reveals a complex interplay of ambition, intellect, and moral transgression. She was a figure of extraordinary intelligence, capable of orchestrating social and psychological manipulation with meticulous precision. Yet, this intelligence, untempered by conscience or restraint, became a tool for cruelty and dominance. Observers noted her capacity to maintain composure even as accusations mounted, a chilling demonstration of self-control and detachment that intensified the horror of her actions. Her ability to manipulate perception, to orchestrate fear, and to provoke both fascination and revulsion underscored the depth of her understanding of human behavior and the extent to which she was willing to exploit it. As investigations progressed, the noblewoman's network of influence and control began to unravel. Allies who had once facilitated her ambitions withdrew, fearful of association with her infamy. Political rivals seized the opportunity to expose weaknesses, undermine credibility, and accelerate legal action. Even the servants, previously bound by fear or loyalty, provided key insights that illuminated patterns of deception and premeditation. The noblewoman, accustomed to wielding power with precision, found herself confronted by forces she could no longer manipulate entirely. Each revelation, each testimony, and each corroborated detail eroded the carefully constructed veneer of control, revealing the stark reality of her vulnerability and the consequences of transgression. The fall from grace was both rapid and dramatic. Social ostracization compounded legal jeopardy, leaving her isolated and exposed. Public fascination continued to grow even as her power waned, with chroniclers, poets, and later historians recounting the horror of the feast in intricate detail. The city, once a stage for her manipulation and ambition, became a theater of moral reckoning, where the consequences of unchecked desire and cruelty were laid bare. The noblewoman's story served as a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how intellect and ambition, when untethered from empathy and ethical restraint, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. By the end of this period, Prague had been forever marked by the events of that night. The noblewoman's meticulously orchestrated banquet had become the centerpiece of her downfall, illustrating the fragility of power built on fear and deception. The investigation, the court proceedings, and the public discourse all contributed to a legacy of horror that would endure for centuries. What had begun as subtle manipulations, clever experiments in control, and the indulgence of ambition culminated in a fall as spectacular as it was inevitable, leaving a city and a generation haunted by the memory of one woman's audacious cruelty and the feast that would never be forgotten. The aftermath of the Dark Feast extended far beyond the immediate scandal, leaving an indelible mark on Prague's history and the collective imagination of Europe. Even after the noblewoman's fall from power, her name persisted in whispered stories, chronicled accounts, and fearful warnings among the aristocracy. The grotesque nature of her crimes, meticulously planned, psychologically manipulative, and morally transgressive, ensured that her legacy was not only preserved but amplified by generations eager to recount a cautionary tale of ambition gone horribly awry. The city, which had once been a stage for her subtle manipulations and sophisticated cruelty, became a repository for memory, legend, and scholarly fascination. Historians, writers, and folklorists over the centuries would repeatedly turn to her story, dissecting its details, speculating on motives, and marveling at the audacity with which she transformed a banquet into a performance of terror. Her influence on Prague's cultural consciousness was profound. The tale of the feast became a lens through which the city examined its own societal vulnerabilities, including the excesses of nobility, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Artists and playwrights drew inspiration from the story, portraying her as a figure both horrific and mesmerizing, a woman who combined intellect, charm, and cruelty in equal measure. Poems and dramatic works recounted the elaborate preparations, the shocked reactions of her victims, and the precise, calculating control she exercised throughout the banquet. In many retellings, her intelligence was emphasized as much as her depravity, highlighting the chilling reality that brilliance and morality are not always aligned. Through these cultural artifacts, the noblewoman's deeds transcended her own lifetime, becoming emblematic of a particular strain of aristocratic excess and moral corruption. Folklore also preserved her story, often blending historical fact with legend, exaggeration, and mythic embellishment. Tales circulated of ghosts wandering the great halls she once occupied, of servants and rivals whose spirits could not rest, and of cursed banquets that would doom those who dared to follow in her footsteps. These narratives, passed orally through generations, reflected both fear and fascination, transforming a historical crime into a cautionary legend with universal resonance. The lines between history and myth blurred, but the underlying horror remained consistent. The noblewoman had demonstrated that the trappings of refinement could mask unimaginable cruelty, and that power, intelligence, and ambition, if untethered from ethical restraint, could lead to unspeakable acts. Historians who later examined her actions often sought to understand the psychology behind such extreme behavior. Was it the product of upbringing, societal pressures, or innate predisposition? Some argued that her early exposure to aristocratic rivalries and observation of human vulnerability had honed her capacity for manipulation. Others suggested that the psychological thrill derived from secrecy, control, and the subtle application of fear contributed to a compulsion that escalated into the horrifying banquet. The consensus was that her intelligence, patience, and social acuity allowed her to orchestrate events with precision, but that moral disengagement and ambition were the catalysts that turned cunning into cruelty. In studying her, scholars illuminated broader truths about the human capacity for manipulation, the allure of power, and the thin line separating civility from barbarity. Her story also prompted reflection on the societal structures that enabled her actions. Prague's nobility, while outwardly governed by decorum and law, operated within a framework that often rewarded cunning, ambition, and ruthless calculation. Rivalries could be lethal, alliances fleeting, and reputation a fragile commodity. Within this context, her actions, while extreme, were an amplification of behaviors already present in the social fabric. The noblewoman became a mirror reflecting the darker tendencies of the aristocracy itself, and her legacy served as a reminder of the potential consequences when ambition, intelligence, and opportunity intersect without moral constraint. Over the centuries, the fascination with her deeds has persisted, influencing both historical scholarship and popular culture. Scholars analyze documents, letters, and court records to reconstruct the feast and its implications, while storytellers and journalists recounted the events with dramatic flair, ensuring the story reached audiences far beyond Prague. True crime enthusiasts, history buffs, and those drawn to tales of human obsession and moral transgression found in her narrative a source of endless intrigue. The story endures because it is both extraordinary and relatable. It demonstrates how ordinary social tools, food, hospitality, charm, and observation, can be twisted into instruments of power and terror when wielded by someone unbound by conscience. Ultimately, the noblewoman's legacy is multifaceted. On one hand, she is remembered as a historical criminal, a figure whose actions shocked and terrified her contemporaries. On the other, she is an enduring symbol of the human capacity for manipulation, ambition, and moral transgression. Her story continues to serve as both warning and fascination, illustrating the extremes to which power and intellect can be applied when divorced from empathy, restraint, or accountability. Prague itself, with its centuries-old streets, palaces, and shadowed alleys, retains echoes of the horror she unleashed, reminding observers that history is not only written by those who triumph, but also haunted by those whose ambition defied morality. Even today, when scholars, tourists, and curious travelers walk the streets of Prague, the story of the Dark Feast lingers in memory, legend, and whispered retellings. The noblewoman, though long gone, inhabits the collective consciousness as a figure of intrigue and dread, a testament to the enduring power of a story where intellect and cruelty intersect, where social performance masks transgression, and where ambition escalates into infamy. The echoes of that night continue to reverberate, a shadow over history and a chilling reminder of the darkness that can reside behind the most polished facades of human civilization. History has long been a mirror in which humanity examines its own capacity for ambition, cruelty, and moral transgression. The story of the noblewoman who orchestrated the Dark Feast in Prague is a chilling example of how intellect, privilege, and opportunity can converge to produce acts that shock the conscience and haunt collective memory. Her life and actions compel us to ask difficult questions. What drives a person to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately harm others for personal gain? How does ambition, when untethered from empathy, evolve into obsession? And why are such stories, though horrifying, endlessly compelling to those who study or witness them centuries later? These questions are not merely academic. They speak to the human condition, the societal structures that enable certain behaviors, and the psychological dynamics that transform desire into danger. One of the most striking lessons of this story lies in the intersection of power and perception. The noblewoman wielded influence not only through wealth, beauty, or rank, but through an unparalleled understanding of human psychology. She recognized the vulnerabilities of those around her, the subtle insecurities, the unspoken rivalries, the latent fears, and used them as instruments to achieve her ends. In many ways, her methods reflect timeless truths about human interaction. Those who understand perception and emotion can manipulate outcomes far more effectively than those who rely solely on force or authority. Yet, her story also serves as a warning. Such skill, when divorced from ethical restraint, can lead to outcomes that are catastrophic not only for others, but eventually for the practitioner herself. The tale also illuminates the dangers inherent in social hierarchies and environments where ambition is rewarded without accountability. Prague's nobility, with its intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and obligations, created both the stage and the conditions for her ascent and eventual atrocity. Within this context, Her actions were extreme, but not entirely anomalous. They were magnified reflections of existing social dynamics taken to their most horrifying conclusion. This observation invites broader reflection. History is replete with examples of individuals who exploited systemic weaknesses, whether in political systems, corporate hierarchies, or social institutions. Her story reminds us that societal structures can both empower brilliance and magnify depravity, and that vigilance, ethical frameworks, and accountability are essential to prevent the escalation of ambition into harm. Psychologically, the Noblewoman represents a case study in the complexities of human motivation. Ambition, intelligence, and curiosity are traits often celebrated, yet when coupled with a lack of moral restraint, they can produce extreme behavior. Her experiments with control, observation, and manipulation were not impulsive acts. They were methodical, deliberate, and psychologically sophisticated. She studied her victims, anticipated reactions, and orchestrated circumstances to maximize both control and impact. Understanding her behavior forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, that intelligence and charm can coexist with cruelty, that social grace can mask calculated malevolence, and that even in structured societies, individuals can find ways to subvert norms for personal gain. Another lesson emerges in the enduring fascination with her story. The Dark Feast is retold not merely as a historical crime, but as a narrative of human obsession, transgression, and the shadowy depths of desire. True crime enthusiasts, historians, and the public alike are drawn to the story because it combines intellect, horror, and the extraordinary audacity of one individual's actions. This fascination reflects a broader cultural engagement with morality, power, and transgression. We are captivated not just by the acts themselves, but by the minds behind them, the societal pressures that shaped them, and the consequences that followed. In this sense, history becomes both a warning and a mirror, showing us what humans are capable of when ambition eclipses conscience. Her story also provides a lens for ethical reflection. It challenges us to consider the consequences of our choices, the responsibilities inherent in positions of power, and the moral limits of ambition. While few will ever replicate her extremes, her narrative underscores the importance of self-awareness, empathy, and ethical deliberation in all pursuits. Societies, too, must remain vigilant. Structures that reward success without scrutiny or accountability create conditions where extraordinary abilities can be applied destructively. The Noblewoman's tale serves as a stark reminder that intellect, privilege, and opportunity are double-edged, capable of producing both great achievement and profound harm, depending on the moral compass that guides them. Finally, the story invites reflection on memory, history, and legacy. The Noblewoman's actions, horrifying as they were, have endured in collective consciousness because they illuminate essential truths about humanity: the capacity for cruelty, the allure of control, and the consequences of unbridled ambition. Her legacy, while rooted in fear and revulsion, also offers insight into resilience, observation, and the interplay of power and morality. For modern audiences, her story is simultaneously cautionary and compelling, a study in how darkness can manifest, how society responds, and how history remembers those who straddle the line between genius and monstrosity. In the end, the lessons from her shadow extend far beyond Prague or her century. They resonate with anyone who examines human behavior, social structures, or moral dilemmas. They remind us that brilliance and cruelty can coexist, that ambition without ethics can devastate lives, and that the past holds mirrors for the present. By studying the Noblewoman and the Dark Feast, we confront the enduring tension between human aspiration and human limitation, between desire and conscience, between power and responsibility. It is in this tension that history teaches its most profound lessons, offering both fascination and warning to all who dare to look into its shadows.